There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry around in their heads. It involves two superpowers glaring at each other across a wall, stockpiling weapons they never intended to use, negotiating treaties over conference tables while men in suits photographed each other's faces looking grim. It involves a kind of suspended tension, the held breath of history, a long standoff that ended without a bang. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was a continuous state of preparation for annihilation, maintained through bureaucratic habit, institutional inertia, and a quiet institutional faith that if a system was designed carefully enough, it would not have to be explained after the fact. What actually filled those decades was a machinery that had been assembled to end the world cleanly and completely. Not in a rage, not out of ideology, but in response to a signal, a number crossing a threshold, a radar return that matched the parameters, a dial turning into a zone marked red. The ideology had been translated years before into engineering. The belief that the enemy would strike first had been translated into specifications. The fear of being caught unprepared had been translated into automated trigger sequences, launch windows measured in minutes, and command structures designed to function with or without the people who had originally authorized them. What you are about to hear is not a story about intention. It is a story about systems, 22 of them, specifically, each one built to address a particular fear, a particular gap, a particular nightmare scenario that had been formally identified and converted into a requirement. Some of them were physical, some were procedural, some were buried underground, and some were encoded in protocols that few people ever read in their entirety. Each one represented the best thinking of its era about how to survive, or more precisely, how to ensure that whatever survived would retain the capacity to respond. The difference between survival and response was not always clearly defined. That ambiguity was not accidental. It was, in many cases, a design choice. The first thing to understand about the American nuclear posture in the early 1950s is that it was built around a simple and terrifying premise. The United States would not be able to absorb a surprise attack and recover in time. The distances were too large, the warning windows too short, and the weapons too destructive. The conclusion drawn from this was not that war should be avoided at any cost. The conclusion was that war, if it came, needed to begin on American terms. This meant that detecting the beginning of an enemy attack was not enough. You needed to detect it early enough to get your own weapons off the ground before they were destroyed on the pad. You needed, in other words, to be prepared to launch before the enemy's weapons arrived. That logic was called launch on warning, and once it was formalized, it required an entire supporting architecture. You needed sensors that could detect an incoming attack. You needed communications that could carry the warning fast enough to matter. You needed command structures that could authorize a response in the minutes available. And you needed to be willing, at some level, to accept that those systems might occasionally be wrong. The distant early warning line, known as the DW line, was the first major physical expression of this logic. It was a chain of radar stations stretching across the Arctic, from Alaska to Iceland, built between 1954 and 1957 at a cost of around $500 million. The stations were positioned to catch Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole, which was the most direct route from Soviet territory to American cities. The DW line gave an estimated 4 hours of warning time. That was considered barely enough. The construction of the DW line required moving enormous quantities of equipment to some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth. Workers operated in temperatures that killed machinery. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles. The project was completed on a schedule that would have been considered impossible before the fear of Soviet attack made it mandatory. When it was finished, it represented one of the largest construction projects in North American history. Most of the people who benefited from it never knew it existed. The DW line was not designed to stop an attack. It was designed to generate data. That data would flow into command centers and trigger decisions. The quality of those decisions depended entirely on the quality of the data and on the judgment of the people receiving it. Both of those dependencies turned out to be problems. In 1960, a radar installation connected to the NORAD early warning system interpreted the rising moon as a massive Soviet missile launch. The system, which had been calibrated for aircraft and missiles and not for large objects rising over the horizon at predictable intervals, generated an alert consistent with an all-out attack. The alert was not acted upon because a human being noticed that the timing did not make sense given the diplomatic situation. That human judgment was not part of the system. It was outside the system. The system itself had done exactly what it was designed to do. That incident was classified. It remained classified for decades. It joined a category of events that the institutions involved had no formal mechanism for sharing with the public and limited incentive to share with each other. The category grew over time. The semi-automatic ground environment, known as SAGE, was the second major system, and it represented something new in the history of computing. SAGE was a network of massive computers, each one housed in a building the size of a city block, connected to radar inputs across the continent and designed to track incoming aircraft and calculate interception trajectories. It was, at the time it was built, the largest and most expensive computer system ever assembled. The computers themselves, the IBM AIN FSQ-7, weighed around 300 tons each and consumed enough electricity to power a small city. SAGE was partially operational by 1958 and fully operational by 1963. By that point, it was already becoming obsolete because the primary threat had shifted from bombers to ballistic missiles, and SAGE had not been designed to track ballistic missiles. The system that had been built at enormous cost to defend against one threat was deployed into a world where that threat had been superseded by a different one. It remained in operation for decades anyway, because replacing it was complicated, and the institutional knowledge embedded in it was not easily transferred. The gap between the threat SAGE was designed to address and the threat that actually materialized was not a secret. It was known before SAGE was fully deployed. The decision to complete and operate the system anyway reflected something that would appear repeatedly in the history of Cold War defense infrastructure: the difficulty of stopping something once it had acquired its own institutional momentum. SAGE employed thousands of people. It had contractors, oversight committees, operational doctrines built around its capabilities. Shutting it down would have required someone to formally acknowledge that the money had been spent on the wrong thing. No one was positioned to do that cleanly. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, BMEWS, was built to address the gap that SAGE could not fill. Where SAGE tracked aircraft, BMEWS was designed to detect ballistic missiles on their way from Soviet launch sites to American targets. The system used massive phased-array radar installations in Thule, Greenland, Clear, Alaska, and Fylingdales Moor in England. Each installation required excavating terrain, pouring enormous concrete foundations, and erecting radar arrays large enough to detect objects the size of a trash can at distances of thousands of miles. BMEWs provided a theoretical warning time of 15 minutes for missiles launched from Soviet territory. 15 minutes, in practice, was not 15 minutes of decision-making time. It was 15 minutes of everything, including the time required to authenticate the warning, convene whatever decision-making authorities were available, communicate with the relevant commanders, and initiate whatever response had been decided upon. The practical decision window was closer to 5 or 6 minutes. Some analyses reduced it further. The designers of BMEWS understood this. The solution they arrived at was not to extend the warning time, which was physically impossible given the geometry of ballistic trajectories. The solution was to develop procedures that could function within the available window. Those procedures involved pre-delegation. They involved authority being distributed down the chain of command in advance. They involved, in some formulations, the acceptance that a response might be initiated before the attack had been fully confirmed. In October of 1960, one of the BMEW's installations generated what appeared to be an indication of a massive Soviet missile launch. The alert was evaluated and determined to be a false alarm. The source, which was not immediately apparent, was later identified as the radar return from the moon rising over the horizon. The same phenomenon that had triggered the 1960 NORAD incident had reproduced itself in the new system. The engineers had not anticipated it. The calibration had not accounted for it. This was not the last time BMEWs generated a false alarm. The system that had been built to provide definitive warning of an attack proved capable of generating warnings that were definitive in form but incorrect in substance. The question of how a human being was supposed to distinguish between them in 5 minutes was never fully resolved. The nuclear command and control system that existed in the United States during the Cold War was not a single thing. It was a layered architecture of authorities, procedures, communications channels, and physical systems, each one designed to address a specific vulnerability identified in the layer beneath it. The system grew by accretion, each addition creating new vulnerabilities that required their own solutions. The National Military Command Center, established in the Pentagon in the early 1960s, served as the primary node for receiving warning data and transmitting launch orders. It was connected to radar networks, satellite systems, intelligence feeds, and the command posts of the various military services. It was staffed continuously. It had backup communications channels for every primary channel. It had procedures for every scenario that had been formally identified and a number that had not. The vulnerability of the National Military Command Center was obvious to anyone who thought about it. It was located in a large building in the middle of a major metropolitan area. It was not hardened against nuclear effects. A single weapon of sufficient yield detonated over Washington would render it non-functional. This was not a theoretical concern. Soviet targeting doctrine included American command and control infrastructure as a priority target. The answer was the Looking Glass aircraft, a modified EC-135 that served as an airborne command post. Beginning in 1961, Looking Glass flew continuous airborne alert missions. For nearly 3 decades, there was always at least one Looking Glass aircraft in the air at any given time, staffed with a general officer who held the authority to issue nuclear launch orders if contact with ground command centers was lost. The aircraft carried the communication equipment necessary to reach launch facilities and submarine forces. It was, in effect, a flying nuclear command center designed to survive the destruction of the fixed command center on the ground. The Looking Glass program continued uninterrupted for 29 years. The aircraft were refueled in the air. Crews rotated on a schedule designed to maintain continuous coverage. The cost of this continuous airborne presence was absorbed into the defense budget without attracting significant public attention. The program was not classified in its existence, but its operational details, the communications protocols, the delegation authorities, the specific conditions under which the airborne commander could act independently, were not public information. What Looking Glass represented, in structural terms, was the formalization of a decision chain that could function without the people who had been elected to make those decisions. The aircraft's commanding general had authority that derived not from democratic process, but from a pre-established chain of command that anticipated the death of everyone above him in that chain. Whether this was a feature or a problem depended on which aspect of the situation you were most afraid of. The hardened underground command center at Raven Rock Mountain, officially designated Site R, was built into a granite mountain in Pennsylvania as an alternate command facility. It was designed to withstand the overpressure from a nuclear detonation within a relatively short distance. Inside the mountain, the facility contained office space, communications equipment, power generation, water storage, and everything else required to run a government response to nuclear war. It was connected to other facilities by dedicated communications lines. It housed, at various times, components of the continuity of government apparatus that had been developed to ensure that some version of federal authority would survive. Site R's existence was not entirely secret. Its general location was known, but its capacity, its manning levels, its role in the command and control architecture, and the specific protocols governing its activation were controlled information. People who worked there did not discuss their work. The mountain absorbed people and equipment and classified procedures, and what happened inside it was part of an architecture designed to function in circumstances where accountability to the public would no longer be practically meaningful. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex, NORAD's hardened command center, built inside a Colorado mountain and opened in 1966, was in many ways the most visible symbol of Cold War command architecture. Constructed at a cost of approximately $142 million, the facility was excavated from solid granite. Its main buildings mounted on giant springs to absorb the shock of nearby detonations, its ventilation systems equipped to filter radioactive particles, its water supply sealed, its power generation independent. 15 freestanding buildings inside the mountain house the equipment and personnel responsible for tracking every aircraft and missile approaching North American airspace. Cheyenne Mountain was designed to survive a nuclear detonation in its vicinity. The specific yield it was designed to withstand reflected an analysis of Soviet targeting doctrine and weapon capability at the time of its design. By the time it was completed, Soviet weapon yields had increased and targeting had improved, meaning that the facility's hardened design was already optimistic. This was understood by the people who worked there. It was not considered a reason to stop using it. The facility operated continuously. The displays inside tracked objects in space and in the atmosphere around the clock. The people staffing those displays had access to the most current information available about the state of the world's aerospace environment. They were also operating in an information environment designed to generate alerts, and the history of those alerts included a number of occasions when the information was wrong. In 1979, a technician at Cheyenne Mountain accidentally loaded a training tape containing a simulated Soviet nuclear attack into the operational system. For approximately 6 minutes, the displays showed an incoming attack. Duty officers began the response protocols. Missile crews were placed on a higher alert status. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was called at home and told to expect a call confirming the attack before he needed to wake President Carter. The second call came, but it carried different information. Satellites that should have shown the launch signatures had shown nothing. The training tape was identified. The alert was stood down. 6 minutes. The amount of time it took to identify the error was 6 minutes. The protocols designed to catch false alarms before they became launches had caught this one. The next one might have different characteristics. 3 weeks later, a second false alert was generated at Cheyenne Mountain. This time the cause was a failed computer chip. The chip, which cost 46 cents, caused the system to display a partial attack that had the appearance of a real launch. Again, duty officers initiated alert procedures. Again, satellite data that should have confirmed the attack did not. Again, the alert was stood down. The institutional response to these incidents was procedural. Review processes were improved. Confirmation requirements were strengthened. The training tape procedures were changed. The report produced after the incidents identified the specific failures and specified corrective actions. What it did not and could not do was address the fundamental condition that made the incidents possible, a system operating continuously at a level of sensitivity designed to detect an attack that might come without warning, staffed by human beings who were required to make decisions in minutes, with information that was occasionally wrong. The perimeter system, developed in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s and early 1980s and known in the West as Dead Hand, was the Soviet answer to a different version of the same problem. The Soviet leadership had concluded that a successful American first strike could eliminate the Soviet command structure before it could authorize a retaliatory response. The solution was a system that could detect the occurrence of a nuclear attack through a combination of seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and communications monitoring, and could then transmit launch orders to Soviet missiles without requiring authorization from living human commanders. The specific details of how perimeter worked were not known to American intelligence for many years. What was known was that the Soviet Union had invested heavily in command and control survivability, and that some of this investment had produced automated or semi-automated systems. The precise degree of automation, the specific conditions under which the system could act independently, and the identity of the human beings who had final authority over it remained opaque. What made perimeter significant in the context of Cold War defense architecture was not its technical specifications. It was what it represented about the logic that had taken hold in both superpowers. Both sides had concluded that the most dangerous scenario was a decapitation strike that eliminated command authority before retaliation could be authorized. Both sides had responded by developing systems designed to retaliate even if command authority was gone. Both sides had, in effect, created mechanisms to ensure that a nuclear war, once started, would continue regardless of whether anyone in a position of authority had decided it should. The Trident submarine program, which produced the most survivable leg of the American nuclear triad, was built around a related logic. A submarine carrying ballistic missiles and operating in deep water was almost impossible to locate and destroy. This made it the most reliable component of the retaliatory force. It also created a specific problem. How do you communicate with a submarine operating at depth in the middle of an ocean in the middle of a nuclear war? The answer required the development of very low-frequency radio systems capable of penetrating seawater to communicate with submerged submarines. The primary system was TACAMO, which stood for Take Charge and Move Out, a fleet of aircraft carrying trailing wire antennas miles long, broadcasting on frequencies that could reach submarines hundreds of feet below the surface. TACAMO aircraft operated on continuous airborne alert alongside Looking Glass, another loop of flying machines maintaining the threads of a command architecture that was designed to keep functioning after everything on the ground had stopped. Trident submarines themselves were not passive. They carried communication buoys they could deploy to receive messages from the surface. They had procedures for surfacing at specified intervals to receive communications. They operated under orders that covered a range of scenarios, including the scenario in which communications had been cut and the crew could not confirm what had happened. The specific orders covering that scenario were held in safes on the submarine. They had not been written to require confirmation from above. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, the PSYOP, was the document that told the American military what to do with its nuclear arsenal. It was not a plan in the sense of a flexible response to varied circumstances. It was a plan in the sense of an execution sequence, a list of targets, a list of weapons assigned to those targets, and a timeline for delivery. The PSYOP was updated regularly as new intelligence on Soviet targets was developed and as new weapons entered the inventory. The PSYOP was one of the most closely held documents in the American government. Even senior officials with high security clearances were not given access unless they had a specific need. When new presidents were briefed on it, the briefing was sometimes described as the most disturbing experience of their presidency. The plan reflected decades of target selection analysis, damage criteria development, and sequencing logic. It had become, over time, something that very few people fully understood in its entirety, because understanding it entirely required not just reading the document, but grasping the weight of what it described. What the PSYOP described, in its various iterations, was the destruction of Soviet and Chinese industrial capacity, military capability, and governmental infrastructure on a scale that would, if executed, kill tens of millions of people and likely trigger climatic effects that would kill tens of millions more. The plan had been developed by people who understood this. They had not developed it because they wanted those outcomes. They had developed it because the alternative, having no plan, seemed worse than having one. The Minuteman missile force represented the land-based leg of the nuclear triad, deployed in hardened silos across the northern Great Plains, in states including Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and elsewhere. The Minuteman missiles were designed to survive a Soviet attack, at least the first wave of it, and launch in response. The silos were hardened to withstand overpressures that most structures could not survive. The missiles themselves were maintained in a continuous state of readiness that allowed them to be launched within minutes of receiving an authenticated order. The crews who maintained and operated the Minuteman missiles lived in underground capsules near the silos, working 12-hour shifts, maintaining readiness for an event that their training told them was always possible and their experience told them had not happened yet. The psychological dimension of this work, the sustained readiness for an event that would, if it came, be catastrophic and final, was understood by the Air Force as a management problem. Selection criteria for missile crew members included psychological screening. Procedures were designed to prevent any single individual from acting unilaterally. The two-person rule required that any launch action be confirmed by two crew members independently. The locks on the launch equipment required simultaneous inputs. What the two-person rule and the procedural controls addressed was the scenario of an individual acting on their own judgment or on a mental health crisis. What they did not address was the scenario of two crew members who had received an authenticated order and were executing their training. The controls were designed to prevent unauthorized launch. They were not designed to prevent authorized launch because preventing authorized launch was not the goal. The goal was to make authorized launch as fast and reliable as possible. The nuclear surety program that the Air Force developed over the years to address the human factors in missile operations was detailed and comprehensive. It covered everything from the screening of personnel to the maintenance of equipment to the procedures for handling anomalies. It produced a large body of documentation about what could go wrong and how to prevent it. That documentation was not publicly available. What was eventually declassified, partly through the work of researchers using the Freedom of Information Act, was a picture of a system that had experienced a wide range of incidents throughout the Cold War. Missiles that had been accidentally damaged during maintenance, safety procedures that had been circumvented out of inconvenience, communication equipment that had failed at critical moments, security breaches that had been identified and handled quietly. The incidents were individually manageable. Their cumulative existence suggested a system operating under conditions that made some level of unplanned occurrence inevitable. The most significant accident in the history of the American missile force occurred in 1980 at a Titan II missile silo near Damascus, Arkansas. A maintenance worker dropped a socket wrench while performing routine work on the missile. The wrench fell and struck the missile's first stage, puncturing the fuel tank. Fuel began leaking. The decision about how to respond to the leak took several hours and involved consultation up the chain of command. During that time, the situation in the silo deteriorated. Eventually, the leaking fuel ignited. The explosion ejected the missile's re-entry vehicle, which contained a nuclear warhead from the silo. The warhead did not detonate. The safety mechanisms functioned, but the explosion killed one Air Force technician and injured 21 others, and the warhead landed in a ditch some distance from the silo. The Damascus incident was not classified in the sense that it never happened. It was classified in the sense that the details of what had gone wrong, the specific decisions that had been made, the safety recommendations that had not been implemented, were not available to the public. The investigation produced a detailed report. The report was held within the Air Force and the Department of Defense. The public received a briefing that acknowledged the explosion and the warhead and noted that there had been no nuclear detonation. The Permissive Action Link, or PAL, was the device designed to prevent unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. PALs are electronic locks built into nuclear weapons that require the input of an authenticated code before the weapon can be armed. The concept was straightforward. If a weapon could not be used without a code known only to authorized command authorities, then theft, accident, or unauthorized action by military personnel could not result in a nuclear detonation. The development and deployment of PALs was not instantaneous. There was a period during the Cold War when American nuclear weapons deployed to NATO allies in Europe did not have PALs, or had PALs that could be bypassed by military personnel who knew the procedure. The Air Force resisted PALs for years on the grounds that they would slow response times and introduce a single point of failure into the authorization chain. The argument was that if the PAL code could not be transmitted in time, the weapons would be useless. The counter-argument was that if the weapons could be used without authorization, the command structure had no control over them. The debate about PALs was institutional, procedural, and conducted entirely within classified channels. It was resolved eventually in favor of deploying PALs broadly. But the resolution came after years during which nuclear weapons in the field were less controlled than the public was aware. The Vela satellite program was built to monitor compliance with the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. The Vela satellites carried sensors designed to detect the characteristic double flash of a nuclear explosion. They were positioned in high orbits where they could observe large areas of the Earth's surface. On September 22, 1979, a Vela satellite detected a double flash over the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean near the Crozet Islands. The signal had the characteristics of a small nuclear explosion, estimated in the range of 2 to 3 kilotons. The event was investigated by a panel of scientific experts convened by the Carter administration. The panel concluded that the evidence was ambiguous and that the signal might have been caused by the impact of a small meteoroid on the satellite. They did not conclude that no explosion had occurred. They concluded that they could not determine with confidence what had occurred. The 1979 Vela incident has never been fully explained. Subsequent analyses have suggested, based on acoustic data and other physical evidence, that it may have been a nuclear test conducted by South Africa, possibly in collaboration with Israel. Both countries denied any involvement. The United States government accepted the ambiguous finding of the scientific panel and did not pursue the matter further in public. What the Vela incident illustrated was that the systems built to monitor the nuclear activities of other nations were capable of generating data that could not be definitively interpreted, and that the response to such data could be shaped by political considerations as much as scientific ones. The intelligence system and the policy system were not separate. The data generated by one fed into the other, and the institutional pressures on both shaped what conclusions were reached and what conclusions were recorded. The SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft was not strictly a defense system in the sense of being designed to respond to an attack. It was a collection system, a machine for finding out what the adversary was doing. But collection and defense were not separate activities in the Cold War. You could not defend against something you could not detect. The SR-71, which first flew in 1966 and remained in service until 1990, was designed to fly faster and higher than anything that could shoot it down. It operated at altitudes above 80,000 feet and speeds exceeding Mach 3. Soviet air defense systems tracked it, but could not intercept it. What the SR-71 collected: photographs of Soviet military installations, airfields, missile sites, naval facilities, industrial complexes, fed into the intelligence architecture that informed everything from targeting decisions to treaty verification to the assessments of Soviet capability that drove American defense spending. The aircraft flew over territory where it had not been invited. The overflights were considered acts of espionage under international law. They were conducted routinely and at the highest levels of governmental authorization. The SR-71 program was accompanied by a level of technical security that went beyond ordinary classification. The materials from which the aircraft was made, the titanium alloys, the specialized fuels, the sensor systems, were all classified. The operating procedures were classified, the routes flown were classified, the images collected were classified. The entire activity existed within a security envelope that separated it from the normal functioning of government and ensured that what was known and what was collected would remain controlled by the small number of people who needed to know. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft preceded the SR-71 and operated at lower altitudes that ultimately made it vulnerable. The shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 over Soviet territory in 1960 was one of the defining incidents of the Cold War, not because of what the aircraft had been doing, which everyone in both governments knew, but because it made the doing of it impossible to deny. The Eisenhower administration had maintained a cover story about a weather research aircraft. The Soviets produced the wreckage and the pilot. The cover story collapsed. The planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was cancelled. What the U-2 incident illustrated about Cold War defense systems was a principle that applied beyond reconnaissance aircraft. The systems worked as long as their existence could be managed within the framework of plausible deniability. When that framework broke, the systems became political problems. The institutional response to this pattern was not to stop building and operating systems that required plausible deniability. It was to build them more carefully, classify them more completely, and ensure that the cover stories were more robust. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, was formally established in 1958 as a joint American-Canadian command responsible for the aerospace defense of North America. It integrated the radar networks, the fighter interceptor force, and the command and control systems responsible for responding to air attack. Its creation represented the formalization of a defense relationship between the two countries that had been developing informally since the beginning of the Cold War. NORAD operated under procedures that had been developed over years of institutional experience and scenario planning. Those procedures addressed the most likely attack scenarios and specified the responses to them. They addressed the authority of various commanders at various levels to make decisions. They addressed the conditions under which nuclear weapons could be released to interceptor aircraft. What NORAD also managed was a continuous flow of raw data from radar systems that required human beings to interpret it in real time. The interpretation process was imperfect. The training tape incident in 1979 and the computer chip failure later that year were part of a larger pattern of NORAD-related false alerts that had been accumulating since the network became operational. A full accounting of those incidents has never been published. What has been made available through declassification and research suggests that the rate of serious false alarms was higher than the public was told. The Defense Support Program, DSP, satellite system was designed to detect the infrared signature of missile launches using sensors in geostationary orbit. Where BMEWs detected missiles in flight using ground-based radar, DSP was designed to detect the launch itself, giving earlier warning and providing information about where the missiles were coming from. The first DSP satellite was launched in 1970. The system expanded over subsequent years as more satellites were added to the constellation. DSP was one of the most closely held programs in American intelligence. The existence of the satellites was known, but the specific capabilities, the sensitivity of the sensors, the processing done on the data before it reached analysts, the procedures for evaluating and acting on DSP alerts were controlled at the highest classification levels. The reason for this control was straightforward. If the Soviet Union knew exactly what DSP could detect, it could structure its operations to avoid detection. If it knew the thresholds at which DSP would generate alerts, it could calibrate activities to stay below them. DSP generated false alarms as well. In 1980, a DSP satellite reported a large-scale Soviet missile attack. The report was generated by a sensor anomaly caused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. The false alarm was evaluated and determined to be non-credible before any response actions were taken. But the evaluation took place within the alert procedures, meaning that forces were placed at elevated readiness before the determination was made. The pattern of false alarms generated by American early warning systems across the Cold War was not random noise. It was a structural feature of systems designed to err on the side of sensitivity. A system calibrated to catch every real attack would inevitably generate false alerts when it encountered conditions it had not been calibrated to handle. The designers of these systems understood this trade-off. They had concluded, in each case, that missing a real attack was worse than generating false alarms. What they had not fully addressed was the cumulative effect of operating under conditions of continuous elevated false alarm risk over decades. The Emergency Rocket Communication System, ERCS, was one of the more unusual elements of the command and control architecture. It consisted of specially modified ballistic missiles launched from silos in the Midwest that, instead of carrying nuclear warheads, carried radio transmitters. In a scenario where ground-based and airborne communications had been destroyed by Soviet attack, ERCS missiles would be launched on a ballistic trajectory and broadcast coded launch orders to American forces during their flight time. The missiles would transmit for the duration of their flight and then fall back to Earth. ERCS was designed to address the scenario in which the command and control structure had been largely destroyed, but the missile force had survived and needed to be reached. It was, in essence, a dead hand that did not automate the launch decision, but automated the delivery of the launch order. Someone still had to decide to launch ERCS, but that someone could have already died if the decision had been pre-made and the ERCS missiles had been placed on a trigger that activated under specified conditions. The distinction between pre-made decisions and automated decisions became increasingly blurred as the Cold War progressed. The number of scenarios that had been formally evaluated, with responses pre-specified, expanded continuously. The number of people empowered to authorize responses expanded as the recognized risk of decapitation grew. The result was a system in which a very large number of actions had been pre-authorized under a very large number of conditions, and the role of real-time human judgment in preventing catastrophe was smaller than it appeared from the outside. The Ground Wave Emergency Network, GWEN, was built in the late 1980s to provide a communications network that could survive a nuclear attack by using very low-frequency radio waves that travel along the surface of the Earth rather than through the atmosphere. The GWEN network consisted of relay towers across the continental United States, each one capable of receiving and retransmitting messages. Because the system used ground waves rather than atmospheric propagation, it was designed to function even if nuclear explosions had disrupted the ionosphere. GWEN was controversial from the moment it was proposed, partly because its towers needed to be sited in populated areas to achieve the coverage required, and partly because the rationale for building it, surviving a nuclear war and being able to send orders during one, was difficult for the public to understand as a reassuring capability. The opposition to individual GWEN towers created significant siting problems for the program. Several planned tower locations were abandoned after local resistance. The network that was eventually built was smaller than originally planned and covered less of the country than the designers had specified as necessary. The GWEN controversy illustrated a dynamic that appeared periodically throughout the Cold War. The tension between the requirements of the defense systems and the reactions of populations who were asked to host those systems. Communities near DW line stations, BMEWS installations, missile silos, and command facilities were asked to accept proximity to military infrastructure that had been built to address threats that were not always clearly communicated to them. The acceptance of that infrastructure was generally taken for granted by the planners. When it was not forthcoming, the planners treated it as a political problem rather than as a signal about public understanding of what the systems were for. The hardened intersite cable system, HICS, was a buried communications network designed to connect Minuteman launch control facilities with each other and with higher command levels, even after a nuclear attack had disrupted surface communications. The cables were buried deep enough to survive the overpressures from nearby detonations. They were routed to avoid likely target areas. They were hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects from nuclear explosions. CHICS represented the infrastructure version of the same logic that had produced Looking Glass and ERCS. The recognition that any communication system operating above ground or through the atmosphere was potentially vulnerable, and that survivable nuclear command and control required physical redundancy below ground. The cost of building this redundancy was absorbed into the broader cost of the nuclear command architecture, which was itself a small fraction of the total defense budget, which was itself not fully transparent to the public. The cost of the systems described in this account, taken together, ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of the Cold War in the currencies of their respective decades. The accounting was not straightforward because the programs were classified at various levels, funded through multiple appropriations, and sometimes combined in ways that made their individual costs difficult to separate. What was clear was that the commitment of resources to the maintenance of these systems was continuous and large, and that the justification for that commitment was a threat assessment that remained classified and was periodically updated in ways that were not publicly explained. The Soviet analog of the American defense architecture was known to American intelligence in outline, but not in detail. The Soviet Union maintained its own radar networks, its own airborne command posts, its own hardened command facilities, its own satellite systems for detecting American launches. The Soviet early warning architecture was assessed as less reliable than the American one, partly because of differences in the quality of the underlying technology, and partly because of differences in the organizational culture of the institutions that operated it. The most dangerous moment that the Soviet early warning architecture generated occurred not during a crisis, but on a routine watch day in 1983. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at the Serpukhov 15 Command Center outside Moscow, which housed the displays for the Soviet satellite-based early warning system. At approximately midnight, the system generated an alert indicating that a single American Minuteman missile had been launched at the Soviet Union. Petrov looked at the alert and considered it. The system was new. It had known calibration issues. A first strike by the United States would not consist of a single missile. He reported the alert as a likely false alarm to his superiors and did not pass it up the chain as a genuine attack notification. While he was doing this, the system generated additional alerts, ultimately indicating 5 missiles in flight. Petrov maintained his assessment that the alerts were false. He was correct. The alerts were caused by the satellite mistaking sunlight reflections off high-altitude clouds for missile launches, an error related to the geometry of the satellite's orbit and the angle of the sun at that particular moment on that particular day. If Petrov had reported the alerts as a genuine attack, the information would have reached Soviet political and military leadership within minutes. What they would have done with it cannot be known with certainty. What can be said is that the Soviet strategic doctrine of the time did not favor absorbing a first strike and retaliating afterward. The pressure to respond quickly would have been significant. The September 1983 episode occurred during a period of extreme superpower tension, following the Soviet shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 007 earlier that month and the ongoing NATO exercise Able Archer. The context was not one in which false alarms would be evaluated calmly. Petrov's decision to classify the alert as a false alarm was not an authorized deviation from procedure. It was a judgment call made by a single human being who had enough experience with the system to distrust it at a critical moment. He was later reprimanded for not having filled out his logbook properly during the incident. The reprimand reflected the institutional logic accurately. The system required documentation, not deviation. The Able Archer 83 exercise was a NATO command post exercise in November 1983 that simulated a coordinated nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. It was designed to test NATO's nuclear release procedures and to practice the communications and command sequences that would be used in an actual nuclear crisis. The exercise was realistic. It used actual communication channels. It simulated the political consultations that would precede a nuclear release decision. It involved the actual deployment of commands through actual systems. Soviet intelligence monitoring the exercise could not definitively determine whether it was an exercise. The signals it was seeing were consistent with actual preparations for a nuclear attack. The Soviet intelligence services elevated their assessment of the threat. Soviet nuclear forces in some areas were placed on higher alert status. Soviet aircraft in Eastern Europe were loaded with nuclear weapons and prepared for immediate takeoff. The crisis passed when the exercise ended. The intelligence community became aware of how seriously the Soviets had taken it only afterward, through information provided by a British intelligence source inside Soviet intelligence. The information was alarming. The Reagan administration's response to it was to become somewhat more careful about the rhetoric and the exercises. The systems that had generated the Soviet concern remained in place. The Poseidon submarine-launched ballistic missile represented the second generation of American sea-based deterrence, where the Polaris missiles carried on the first generation of ballistic missile submarines had been relatively accurate for area targets. The Poseidon was designed with improvements that made it capable of threatening hardened targets. This meant that Poseidon submarines were not merely a retaliatory force. They were a potential first strike force capable of threatening the Soviet missiles in their silos. The development of counterforce capability, the ability to threaten the adversary's nuclear forces rather than just their cities, was a continuous source of strategic instability throughout the Cold War. Both sides invested in counterforce capability on the grounds that being able to strike the enemy's weapons reduced the number of weapons that could be used against you. The adversary responded to each improvement in counterforce capability by deploying more weapons, hardening the ones they had, or investing in launch procedures that would get the weapons off the ground before they could be destroyed. The result was an arms race in which each side's defensive investment generated an offensive investment by the other. The MX Peacekeeper missile program in the 1980s was the American attempt to address the vulnerability of the Minuteman force to improved Soviet counterforce capabilities. The MX was larger, more accurate, and carried more warheads than the Minuteman. It was designed to threaten Soviet silos with enough reliability to make the Soviet Union uncertain about whether it could absorb a first strike and still have enough missiles to retaliate effectively. The basing problem, how to make the MX itself survivable against the same Soviet counterforce capabilities that made the Minuteman vulnerable, was never satisfactorily resolved. The MX was eventually deployed in fixed silos that had originally housed Minuteman missiles, a solution that everyone involved acknowledged was not survivable. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in 1983, was the most ambitious attempt during the Cold War to build a defense system capable of actually preventing nuclear weapons from reaching their targets. The concept was to deploy a layered system of interceptors, lasers, and other directed energy weapons in space and on the ground that could destroy Soviet missiles during the boost phase, mid-course phase, and terminal phase of their trajectories. If it worked, it would render Soviet nuclear weapons obsolete. The technical feasibility of SDI was debated intensely throughout the 1980s. The consensus among the scientific community was that the concept as described was not achievable with foreseeable technology. The specific systems proposed, including space-based lasers, nuclear-pumped X-ray weapons, and kinetic kill vehicles, each faced physical and engineering challenges that had not been solved, and in some cases had not been clearly defined. The program generated enormous amounts of research funding, some interesting technical results, and a massive investment in concepts that were never deployed. What SDI did accomplish, regardless of its technical outcome, was to create significant anxiety in Soviet strategic planning circles. The possibility that the United States was serious about deploying a defensive system, even a partially effective one, threatened the calculation that both sides had relied on for decades, that the other side's retaliatory force would survive any first strike and could inflict unacceptable damage in return. If one side could defend against retaliation, the deterrent logic that had kept the peace, to the extent it had, would no longer hold. The Soviet response to SDI included both diplomatic opposition and accelerated work on penetration aids for their missiles, decoys, and other countermeasures that would defeat whatever defenses were deployed. The arms race dynamic had produced another iteration. The Nuclear Planning Group within NATO was the alliance body responsible for developing the doctrine and procedures governing the use of nuclear weapons by NATO forces. Its deliberations were classified. Its membership included the defense ministers of NATO countries. It addressed questions about when nuclear weapons would be used, what authorization would be required, who could release them, and what the objectives of their use would be. The questions the Nuclear Planning Group addressed were not abstract. NATO had deployed theater nuclear weapons in Europe, including artillery shells, bombs, short-range missiles, and cruise missiles. These weapons were in the custody of American forces, but were intended under NATO doctrine to be used against Warsaw Pact forces if conventional defense failed. The conditions under which their use would be authorized and the speed with which that authorization could be obtained, given the pace of a conventional war, were never fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The exercise of these authorization procedures in annual NATO exercises produced results that were sometimes disturbing to participants. The time required to obtain political authorization for nuclear release, even in a training environment with all participants fully cooperative, could exceed the time available given the simulated pace of the conventional battle. The procedural fix that was developed was to pre-delegate some authorization, allowing military commanders to initiate certain preparatory steps without waiting for political authorization. Pre-delegation was not the same as pre-authorization to fire, but the line between the two was not always clear in practice. The cruise missile programs of the 1970s and 1980s introduced a new element into the stability calculations of both sides. Cruise missiles, which fly at low altitudes and are difficult to detect on radar, could carry nuclear warheads with considerable accuracy. The deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe beginning in 1983 as part of the NATO dual-track decision was one of the most politically contentious events of the late Cold War period in Europe, generating enormous public protest and diplomatic crises. The strategic rationale for the cruise missile deployments was straightforward. They were intended to counter Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missiles that had been deployed in the Soviet Union and targeted at Western Europe. The public rationale was presented in terms of responding to the Soviet buildup. The underlying logic was about maintaining the linkage between the defense of Europe and American strategic nuclear forces, ensuring that any Soviet attack on Western Europe would risk escalation to a strategic nuclear exchange. The populations of Western European countries who were asked to host cruise missiles on their territory were not, in most cases, persuaded by this logic. The protest movements against cruise missile deployment in Britain, West Germany, the Netherlands and elsewhere were among the largest in European history. The governments that authorized the deployments did so over significant public opposition. The weapons were deployed. The protests did not stop them. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, established in 1963 following the Cuban Missile Crisis, was not a telephone. It was, initially, a teletype system operating over leased transatlantic cable, later supplemented by satellite circuits. The hotline was designed to allow direct communication between the American and Soviet governments in moments of extreme crisis, to prevent miscalculation from driving events toward war before diplomatic channels could be established. The hotline was used during several crises during the Cold War. In 1967, during the Arab-Israeli War, both sides used it to signal their intentions regarding military movements in the region. In 1971, it was used during the Indo-Pakistani War. In 1973, it was used again during another phase of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In each case, the hotline functioned as intended, providing a channel for communication when others were unavailable or insufficiently direct. What the hotline did not provide, and what its advocates sometimes implied it did provide, was a mechanism for preventing wars from starting. It was a mechanism for communicating after a crisis had already begun. The conditions that might lead to an accidental war, a false alarm generating a response, a miscalculated military exercise being interpreted as preparation for attack, would unfold at a pace that the hotline was not designed to interrupt. By the time a hotline message was sent and received and responded to, the decision cycle of the defense systems might already have advanced past the point where a message could matter. The Trident II D5 missile, which entered service in 1990 and represents the current generation of American submarine-launched ballistic missiles, achieved a combination of accuracy and range that made it, for the first time, a true counterforce weapon. Earlier submarine-launched missiles had been accurate enough to threaten cities, but not hardened missile silos. The D-5 was accurate enough to threaten silos. This meant that ballistic missile submarines were now carrying weapons that could, in theory, support a disarming first strike against Soviet strategic forces. The deployment of the D-5 as the Cold War was ending ensured that the capability that had generated so much instability during the Cold War would be available to whatever strategic relationship followed it. The arms control agreements that were negotiated in the 1980s and early 1990s reduced the numbers of weapons. They did not address the underlying accuracy and capability of the weapons that remained. The intelligent satellite programs of the Cold War, beginning with the Corona program first successfully operated in 1960, provided the photographic reconnaissance capability that the U-2 had partially provided, and that became the primary means of monitoring Soviet military activity. The Corona satellites, operated under the codename Discoverer as a cover, returned film canisters to Earth by ejecting them into the atmosphere where they were caught by aircraft. The program was acknowledged publicly only in 1995. What the intelligence satellites provided was certainty, or something approaching certainty, about Soviet capabilities. Before satellite reconnaissance, American assessments of Soviet military strength relied on fragmentary intelligence from agents, intercepted communications, and aerial reconnaissance. The gap between what was known and what was feared produced assessments that were sometimes significantly wrong in the direction of overestimating Soviet strength. The missile gap of the late 1950s, which contributed to the political pressure for accelerated American missile development, was largely a product of this uncertainty. The satellites revealed that the gap had been largely imaginary. The revelation that the missile gap was not what it had been portrayed to be did not produce a corresponding reduction in American missile programs. The programs had acquired their own institutional momentum. The requirement to maintain overwhelming deterrence was calibrated not to Soviet actual capabilities, but to Soviet potential capabilities, and that calibration required a large and growing force, regardless of what the satellites revealed about what the Soviets actually had. The Atomic Energy Detection System, maintained by the Air Force Technical Applications Center, was the American program responsible for monitoring nuclear explosions anywhere in the world. It used seismic sensors, hydroacoustic sensors, radionuclide sampling, and infrasound detectors to detect and characterize nuclear explosions. The system was developed to verify arms control agreements and to monitor the nuclear activities of all nuclear-armed states. The capabilities of the Atomic Energy Detection System improved continuously throughout the Cold War as new sensors were developed and deployed. By the end of the Cold War, the system could detect nuclear explosions in the range of a kiloton or less anywhere on Earth. It was the technical foundation for the verification provisions of the arms control agreements negotiated in the 1970s and 1980s, and for the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that was negotiated but never ratified by the United States. The limitation of the detection system was not its sensitivity to explosions that occurred. It was its inability to detect preparations for explosions, which was where verification really mattered. The system could tell you that an explosion had occurred. It could not tell you that a state was developing a weapon, or that it had assembled a device that had not yet been tested. The space between what the sensors could detect and what the policymakers needed to know was filled by assessment, which meant by judgment, which meant by the organized application of partial information to questions that did not have certain answers. The entire Cold War defense architecture taken together was a system for managing uncertainty about what an adversary was doing and what an adversary intended. The management of that uncertainty required maintaining capabilities large enough to respond to the worst plausible case, even if the worst plausible case was not the most likely case. The requirements generated by this logic were self-expanding because as each side's capabilities grew, the other side's worst plausible case became worse. The systems described here were not built by people who wanted war, they were built by people who were afraid of war, specifically afraid of being caught unprepared for it. The fear was real. The threat it responded to was real. The Soviet Union was not a fictional adversary. It maintained large nuclear forces and had strategic doctrines that included first-use options under specified circumstances. The fear that drove the American defense architecture was not irrational. But fear, when it is institutionalized, takes on characteristics that do not always serve the interests that generated it. Institutionalized fear creates requirements that expand beyond what the original fear could justify. It creates organizations that maintain themselves by sustaining the fear that created them. It creates procedures that become ends in themselves, valued for their precision and reliability rather than for the outcomes they produce. It creates a kind of bureaucratic momentum that continues even after the conditions that originally justified it have changed. The institutions that built and operated the systems described here did not share this analysis with the public. The analysis was implicit in the institutions themselves, visible to anyone who examined the history of how the systems were built and how they functioned and what they had actually done during the decades of their operation. But the examination required access that was not routinely available, and the incentive to conduct it was not strong when the institutions were functioning and the adversary was still in existence. The period of arms control negotiations that began with the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and continued through the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties of the 1990s produced a framework of agreements that reduced the numbers of deployed weapons, constrained the development of new systems, and established verification mechanisms. The negotiations were technically complex and politically difficult. The agreements that resulted were genuine achievements. What the arms control process could not do was address the systemic features of the nuclear relationship that made it dangerous, independent of the specific numbers of weapons. It could reduce the number of warheads from thousands to hundreds. It could not change the decision timelines that made launch on warning a structural feature of the posture. It could reduce the number of deployed systems. It could not change the institutional cultures that had been built around maintaining those systems. It could verify that weapons had been destroyed. It could not verify that the procedures for using the remaining weapons had been changed. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the event that most clearly illustrated the gap between the formal structures of Cold War deterrence and the actual dynamics of crisis management. The formal structure said that rational actors, facing the prospect of mutual destruction, would not take actions that risked it. The actual dynamics involved decisions made under incomplete information, military pressures that pushed toward escalation, communication failures, and near misses that were not known to either side's leadership in real time. The most significant near miss of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not at the political level, where the negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev were tense but ultimately successful. It was at the operational level, in the waters around Cuba, where a Soviet submarine that had been out of contact with Moscow for days was being depth-charged by American ships as part of a standard procedure for surfacing submarines during a naval quarantine. The submarine, designated B-59, had lost contact with Moscow. The captain and political officer did not know whether a war had started. The submarine was under attack. Under Soviet protocols, the political officer had the authority to authorize the use of the nuclear torpedo on board the submarine. He was ready to use it. He was stopped by the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, who was on board and whose agreement was required under the specific command structure of that vessel. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. The submarine surfaced. The incident was not known to American officials until decades later. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without nuclear war. The reasons it ended that way included the decisions of Kennedy and Khrushchev, the back-channel diplomacy that allowed both sides to find a way out, and the restraint of specific individuals in specific operational situations who chose not to escalate when their training and their orders might have supported escalation. The systems built to manage the Cold War were present throughout the crisis. The systems did not prevent the near misses. People did. The end of the Cold War came in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It came without a war. The systems that had been built to fight that war did not fire. The missiles in their silos returned to lower alert levels. The airborne command post missions were reduced in frequency and eventually suspended. The hardened command centers were maintained, but at lower manning levels. Some were closed. The weapons remained. The procedures remained. The institutional knowledge embedded in the people who had operated the systems for decades aged out as those people retired, but the systems themselves persisted, maintained by their successors and supported by the bureaucratic and industrial infrastructure that had grown up around them. The warheads that had been targeted at Soviet cities were retargeted or placed on a launch-ready status that required additional steps before they could be used, or stored in conditions that made them slightly less accessible than they had been. The early warning systems continued to operate. The satellites continued to orbit. The submarines continued to patrol. The command and control architecture continued to function, updated with new technology, but structured around the same logic that had built it, that the ability to respond to an attack required maintaining the capacity to respond at any moment, and that this capacity required systems that were always on, always ready, and always capable of functioning without the people who had originally authorized their construction. The nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia, as of the final years of the Cold War and the decades that followed, contained thousands of warheads, a reduction from the peaks of the 1980s, but still enough to destroy human civilization many times over. The delivery systems, the missiles, submarines, and aircraft remained capable of reaching their targets. The command and control systems remained capable of transmitting orders. The early warning systems remained capable of detecting launches and generating alerts. The specific incidents described in this account, the training tape false alarm, the computer chip failure, the Petrov incident, the Vela event, the Damascus silo explosion, represent a sample of what the declassified record and investigative journalism have made available. The full record of incidents, anomalies, close calls, and near misses that occurred during the Cold War remains largely classified. The institutions that experienced those incidents had strong incentives to contain the information within their own structures and limited incentives to share it with the public or with oversight bodies. The Cold War ended when one of the two states that had sustained it ceased to exist. The systems built to fight it did not end with it. They were maintained, modified, and in some cases upgraded. The logic that had built them, the logic that said that the capability to respond must be maintained continuously against the possibility of attack, did not require the specific adversary that had originally justified it. The capability was its own justification. The people who built these systems were not wrong to be afraid. The people who operated them were not wrong to maintain them. The people who oversaw them were not wrong to fund them. Each decision, evaluated in the context available at the time, was defensible. The aggregate result of all those defensible decisions was a world in which the end of everything was continuously available, maintained in a state of readiness, sustained by institutions with no interest in its cancellation, and subject to the occasional false alarm, the occasional misinterpretation, the occasional 46-cent computer chip. The Soviet Union is gone. The systems built to respond to it are still here.